Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is January 18th, 2026. Today, we are turning our attention to a figure who, for a blazing moment in history, felt like the absolute center of the political universe. We are talking about Dame Jacinda Ardern.
It really is the perfect time to have this conversation. We are sitting here almost exactly 3 years to the day since she resigned. She's been out of the spotlight, mostly, and she just released her memoir, A Different Kind of Power, back in June of last year, 2025. It feels like the dust has finally settled enough for us to stop reacting to headlines and, actually look at the machinery of her legacy.
Exactly, and what a legacy it is. I mean, we're talking about someone who went from being a list MP, basically a bench warmer in Parliament, to a global icon almost overnight. We had Jacinda Mania, we had the baby at the UN, the Christchurch response, and then, well, the crash.
And that trajectory is what makes this deep dive so vital. The mission for us today is to unpack that phenomenon. We need to understand the massive disconnect between the international superstardom, the Vogue covers, the soft power icon status that she still enjoys here in the UK and in the US, and the domestic reality in New Zealand. Because by the time she gave that famous "nothing left in the tank" speech, her polling numbers had cratered.
We have got a massive stack of sources here. We're pulling from the memoir, obviously, but also coverage from the 2023 resignation, policy analysis from 2024 and 2025, and a biography covering her early years. We are going to cover everything from her days slinging fish and chips to her current fellowship at Harvard.
And just a note before we start, we are going to be rigorous here. This isn't a fan club and it's not a hit piece. We have sources covering the high highs and the low lows. Our job isn't to take a side, but to explain how all these pieces fit together. Because frankly, the gap between St. Jacinda and the frustration felt by many New Zealanders by the end of her term is the most interesting part of the story.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start way back before the magazine covers. Because if you look at the origins, it's actually surprisingly normal. And I think that normalcy is key to understanding her initial appeal.
It is. It really is. She was born in Hamilton in 1980, grew up in small towns like Morrinsville and Murupara. Her dad, Ross Ardern, was a police officer, and her mom worked as a school catering assistant. This wasn't a dynasty. This wasn't, the Kennedy compound.
I love that detail in the biography about her first job. She worked in a fish and chip shop. You can't get more Kiwi than that.
It grounds the narrative. It really does. But if you want to understand her moral framework, the thing that defined her crisis management later, you have to look at her religious background. She was raised Mormon, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
That's a fairly strict upbringing for a future progressive leader, isn't it?
Extremely structured, no alcohol, no caffeine, a very strong emphasis on community and service. But she left the church in 2005 when she was 25. And the reason why is the first real breadcrumb we get regarding her political conviction.
Right, she left because of the church's stance on gay rights.
Precisely. She had flatmates who were gay, friends who were gay, and she just couldn't reconcile the dogma with her lived experience of empathy. She later identified as agnostic. It shows that even in her mid-20s, she was willing to walk away from a massive part of her identity, her community, her family structure, if it clashed with her core values. That creates a very specific kind of politician, one who is principled, but also willing to sever ties.
So she joins the Labour Party at 17, recruited by her aunt. She works for Helen Clark, who was the prime minister at the time, a massive figure in NZ politics. Then she goes to London. Now, this is a detail that always cracks me up. She worked as a senior policy advisor in Tony Blair's cabinet office. That sounds huge.
It sounds incredibly prestigious. It sounds like she was in the war room. But here's the reality check. She never actually met Tony Blair in person.
Not once.
Not once. It just goes to show you the scale of the UK machinery versus the intimate nature of New Zealand politics. In New Zealand, you probably bump into the Prime Minister at the supermarket. In the UK, you can work in their cabinet office and never see them.
Huh. That's amazing.
But she wasn't just a backroom operator. In 2008, she was elected president of the International Union of Socialist Youth. This role took her to Hungary, Jordan, China. She was getting a global perspective on governance before she even hit 30.
Right. Okay, so fast forward a bit. She enters Parliament in 2008. She's young. She's rising through the ranks. But let's jump to 2017, because this is the moment everything changes, the meteor moment.
To understand the magnitude of this, you have to understand the absolute despair in the Labour Party at that time.
Yeah.
It's mid-2017. The election is weeks away. Labour is polling at 24%.
24% is catastrophic. That's not just losing. That's irrelevance.
It's an existential crisis. The leader, Andrew Little, looks at the numbers and basically says, I can't turn this around. I'm the problem. He resigns. On August 1st, 2017, just 7 weeks before the election, Jacinda Ardern takes over.
7 weeks. Most people need 7 weeks to plan a holiday, let alone a national election campaign against a sitting government.
And the reaction was instantaneous.
Okay.
This is where the term Jacinda mania was coined. It wasn't a slow build. Donations to the party started hitting NZ $700 per minute immediately after her appointment.
$700 a minute. That is wild. It sounds like a tech IPO launch, not a political campaign.
It was a surge of energy that New Zealand politics hadn't seen in a generation. They went from 24% to winning 36.9% of the vote. Now hold on, because this is where we need to get technical. 36.9% is amazing growth, but it's not a majority. The National Party still had 44% of the vote.
Right, and this is where we have to explain the New Zealand system, because otherwise the next 3 years make no sense. It's MMP mixed member proportional.
Correct. In the US or the UK, usually the winner takes all. In MMP, you don't need the most votes. You need to get to 61 seats in Parliament. National had the most votes, but they had no friends. No other parties wanted to work with them. Ardern, however, had a path to power, but she needed a coalition partner.
And the partner she got, well, let's just say it was an odd couple situation.
Odd couple is putting it mildly. To form a government, the progressive, young, socialist-leaning Ardern had to strike a deal with Winston Peters and his party, New Zealand First.
For our listeners who don't follow Kiwi politics, who is Winston Peters?
Imagine a populist, nationalist figure. Socially conservative, anti-immigration rhetoric, very focused on the regions and the elderly. If Ardern is the Bernie Sanders or AOC of this equation, Peters is a distinct nationalist flavor. Maybe not fully Trumpian, but certainly a handbrake on progressivism. He became the deputy prime minister.
So wait, you have this global icon of progressivism, but her deputy PM is a conservative nationalist. That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It explains the implementation gap of her first term perfectly. A lot of international observers saw her win and thought, great, now she can implement a socialist utopia. But in reality, Winston Peters acted as a massive handbrake. Capital gains tax, employment law reform. If Winston didn't like it, it didn't happen. She was in office, but she wasn't fully in power.
That context is crucial, because critics later said she was all talk, but structurally she was handcuffed.
Exactly. But she still managed to break molds. She becomes the world's youngest female head of government at 37. And then, the news that went everywhere. The baby.
Yes, January 2018, she announces she's pregnant.
It shattered a glass ceiling that most people didn't even realize was still there. She was only the second elected leader in history to give birth in office. The first was Benazir Bhutto of Pakistan back in 1990. That is a 28-year gap.
And she didn't hide it. The visual of her bringing her daughter, Nefteh Roha, onto the floor of the UN General Assembly, that wasn't just a cute moment. That was a strategic projection of soft power, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It challenged the binary idea that you have to choose between motherhood and high office. It told the world, this is what modern leadership looks like. It bought her an immense amount of goodwill globally.
But that sunny phase didn't last long. The reality of the world came crashing in. We have to talk about March 15th, 2019, the Christchurch mosque shootings.
This was the defining moment of her first term and arguably her entire career. 51 people killed, 49 injured by a white supremacist. It was a horrific, unprecedented act of terror in New Zealand.
And her response? Even looking back from 2026, it stands out. She completely flipped the script on how leaders usually respond to terror. Usually it's about strength, right? It's about hunting down the bad guys.
She did something very specific psychologically. She realized that modern terrorism is performative. The shooter wrote a manifesto designed to go viral. He wanted fame. Ardern identified that immediately. She famously refused to name it. She said, speak the names of those who were lost rather than the name of the man who took them. She denied him the oxygen of notoriety.
And that image of her in the headscarf, hugging a member of the Muslim community, it was projected on the Burj Khalifa. It went everywhere.
It was an image of radical empathy. But, and this is important, it wasn't just performance art. She backed it up with policy speed that makes other democracies look paralyzed.
How fast are we talking?
Within 1 month, specifically 26 days, her government passed laws banning most semi-automatic weapons. In the U.S., you can't get a committee meeting scheduled in 26 days.
That is incredible. How did she manage that with Winston Peters, the conservative gun supporter in the coalition?
That is the power of a crisis. The shock was so profound that the political opposition melted away. She used that moment of national grief to push through legislation that would have been impossible a week earlier. She also established the Christchurch Call with France to combat online extremism.
Which is still relevant today, right?
Very much so. It was a push to get tech companies and governments to sit down and agree on protocols to stop violent content from viralizing. At the time, people thought it was toothless, but looking back from 2026, it actually laid the groundwork for a lot of the content regulation we see now.
So she navigates that horror. And then, just a year later, 2020, COVID-19.
The hits just kept coming. And again, she took a path that was distinct from much of the world. While the UK and US were debating flattening the curve, New Zealand adopted the elimination strategy.
Go hard and go early. I remember that phrase.
They implemented one of the toughest border restrictions in the world and a strict nationwide lockdown alert level 4. But what stood out again was the communication. The Washington Post called it a masterclass in crisis communication.
Yeah.
She did these Facebook Lives, casual, in a sweatshirt, from her home, explaining exactly what was happening and why.
She made people feel like they were part of a team. The team of 5 million.
It was brilliant framing. It wasn't, the government is locking you up. It was, we are all doing this together to save lives. And statistically, it worked. Estimates suggest the strategy saved up to 80,000 lives. Her approval ratings went through the roof. She hit 59.5% as preferred prime minister in the Reid Research poll. That was the highest in the poll's history.
Which leads us directly into the 2020 election. This wasn't just a win, it was a landslide.
It was historic. Labour won 50% of the vote and 65 seats. This was the first time since 1996, since MMP was introduced, that a single party could govern alone.
So she's at the pick. She doesn't need Winston Peters anymore. The handbrake is off. She has a total mandate. You would think this is where it all gets easy, right? This is where she fixes everything.
You would think. But this is actually where the story turns. This is where we have to pivot from Jacinda the crisis manager to Jacinda the prime minister. Because having a total mandate means you have total responsibility. There's no one else to blame if things don't get fixed.
And things weren't getting fixed. We need to talk about the domestic reality. Because while the world saw this saint-like figure back home in New Zealand, the mood was shifting. Let's look at the implementation gap.
This is the crux of the critique against her. There was a growing disconnect between the rhetoric of kindness and transformation and the stubborn statistics of daily life.
Let's start with housing. This has been New Zealand's Achilles heel for a long time.
It has. And Ardern had called the housing crisis a blatant failure of capitalism in the past. That's strong language. But during her time in office, house prices continued to soar. In fact, they exploded.
Why? If she had the power, why couldn't she stop it?
It's a cruel economic irony. To save the economy during COVID, the government and the Reserve Bank pumped billions of dollars into the system wage subsidies, low interest rates. It saved jobs, absolutely. But all that cheap money flowed into assets. Housing prices went vertical. So the very stimulus that kept people employed also priced them out of owning a home.
And she refused to implement a capital gains tax, right, even though Labor had campaigned on it previously.
That was the betrayal for many on the left. In 2019, she ruled out a capital gains tax under her leadership. She did it to preserve political capital, to stay centrist. But when the housing market went crazy in 2021, she had removed the one tool that might have cooled it down. Jacobin magazine was quite savage about this. They argued that for all the transformational talk, her government was effectively managing the neoliberal status quo, not dismantling it.
So you have the left angry about housing. What about child poverty? She appointed herself the Minister for Child Poverty Reduction. That's putting your name right on the problem.
It was a high-risk move. She promised to have child poverty within a decade. And to be fair, looking at the data, they did make progress. They introduced the Families Package, increased benefits, and rolled out free school lunches.
Free school lunches is a big deal for a family struggling.
It is huge. But by the time she left, critics were arguing that she treated the symptoms, not the disease. The systemic drivers of poverty, low wages, high housing costs, hadn't been dismantled. The numbers improved, but not at the transformational speed she had promised in 2017.
So you have this simmering policy frustration. The shine is coming off. And then the mood shifts on COVID.
The Delta variant arrived in late 2021. The zero-COVID strategy, which had been the source of her popularity, suddenly wasn't viable anymore. You can't eliminate Delta or Omicron the way you could the original virus. They had to abandon the strategy in October 2021.
And that's when the team of 5 million started to fracture.
The unity dissolved. You had vaccine mandates, you had lockdowns that dragged on, and people were tired, the economy was hurting, and we saw the occupation of Parliament grounds in early 2022.
I remember seeing the footage. It got ugly.
It got incredibly ugly. We went from Jacinda mania to people screaming abuse at her van. The level of vitriol was intense. She was called a Nazi. She faced death threats. There was a conspiracy theorist actually convicted for threatening to kill her. The Be Kind motto seemed very far away during 2022.
It clearly took a toll. I mean, how could it not? There was that moment in Parliament, the hot mic incident. She called David Seymour, the ACC party leader, an arrogant prick.
It was a very human moment of frustration slipping through the cracks. But what I love about that story is the twist. It shows her ability to pivot. They actually reconciled, signed the transcript of the insult, and auctioned it off for charity.
They raised NZ $60,000 for prostate cancer.
Exactly. It was a flash of that old Ardern charm turning a negative into a positive PR moment. But it couldn't mask the underlying reality. By the end of 2022, Labour was trailing in the polls, and her personal approval had dropped to 29%.
Which brings us to January 2023, the resignation. I remember exactly where I was when I heard it was a shock.
It shocked the world. Leaders usually cling to power until they are dragged out by the voters or their own party. But she stood up at that summer caucus retreat and said, "I know that I no longer have enough in the tank to do it justice."
Not enough in the tank. That phrase became instant history. But let's look at this critically. Was she just burned out, or was she jumping before she was pushed?
It's the million-dollar question. At the time, cynics said she knows she's going to lose the election, so she's getting out to save face. And Labour was definitely on track to lose. But reading her memoir now and looking at the 2025 interviews, I think it was more nuanced.
How so?
She clarified that it wasn't burnout in the clinical sense of a breakdown, it was a professional judgment. She realized that her specific style of leadership, which requires high empathy, high availability, constant emotional connection, requires 100% capacity. If you are operating at 80%, you aren't just tired, you are failing the country.
It's a pretty incredible level of self-awareness, really, to say, I can't do this job the way it deserves to be done, so I'm stopping. Most politicians would just do a bad job and stay in the nice house.
Exactly. It raises a fascinating question about leadership. We often equate endurance with strength, the ability to suffer and stay in power. But maybe the real strength is knowing when you are done.
So, Chris Hipkins takes over. Labour eventually loses the election later that year. But let's look at what happened to Jacinda. It's 2026 now. Where is she? What has she been doing for the last 3 years?
Well, she didn't just disappear into a garden in Morrinsville. She went global. She became a trustee of the Earthshot Prize. That's Prince William's environmental initiative. She took up fellowships at Harvard, focusing on online extremism, which ties back to her Christchurch work.
She got a damehood in 2023 and an honorary degree from Oxford in 2025. She's been collecting accolades like Pokemon cards.
She has. But notice the geography of those accolades. UK, US, global. She's been living in the UK mostly. And this is where that dichotomy we talked about really shows up. She released her memoir, A Different Kind of Power, in June 2025.
And the book tour.
She chose not to tour New Zealand to promote it.
That is telling.
It speaks volumes. She focused her promotion on the UK and the US, The Late Show, the BBC. It suggests that she knows her legacy is complicated at home. The wounds of the mandates, the housing crisis, the economic recession, they are still fresh in New Zealand. But abroad, she is still the immaculate icon of empathy.
She also dipped her toe back into politics a bit, endorsing Kamala Harris in the 2024 U.S. election.
Which aligns perfectly with her international brand. She's moving in those global progressive circles now. She's essentially a diplomat for a specific kind of soft power politics.
There was also that documentary, Prime Minister, that premiered at Sundance last year.
Yes, featuring home videos filmed by her partner, Clark Gayford. It gave a very intimate look at the pressure she was under. It reinforces that narrative of the reluctant participant who stepped up when needed but paid a heavy personal price.
So here we are in 2026, looking back at the Ardern era. How do we sum this up? Because it feels like two different stories.
It is two stories. On the global stage, she redefined what a leader looks and sounds like. She proved that empathy and kindness could be powerful political tools, especially in a crisis. She handled the mosque shootings in the early days of COVID with a grace that few leaders in history could match. She saved lives. That is indisputable.
But at home?
At home, the legacy is stickier. The structural issues she promised to fix, housing, inequality, child poverty, proved incredibly resistant to change. The implementation gap is real. It's a reminder that great communication is essential, but it doesn't lower the price of milk or rent.
It's the difference between being a great crisis manager and a great reformer.
Exactly. She was a brilliant captain in a storm. She could keep the ship afloat when the waves were 50 feet high. But when the waters calmed and the passengers asked, "Okay, but why is the engine still broken?" She struggled to find the fix.
And I think that brings us to our final thought for you, the listeners. Jacinda Ardern famously left because she didn't have enough in the tank. In a world where we see career politicians clinging to power for decades, often long past their prime, acting as if they are indispensable,
Yeah.
is the ability to recognize when to walk away actually a leader's most underappreciated strength? Or does walking away leave the hard work unfinished for someone else to clean up?
It is a question worth mulling over. Is leaving an act of courage or an act of abandonment? I think the answer depends entirely on whether you're looking at her from London or from a rental property in Auckland.
That is a fascinating place to leave it, a complex figure for a complex time. Thank you for helping us unpack the Ardern era,
My pleasure.
and thank you for listening. We will catch you on the next deep dive.